This is a real exciting step in your journey. We're going to cover a lot of cool things and go over a lot of cool material and also get a lot of hands-on experience. So in this video, let's cover what this course is all about and what we're going to get into. We're going to kick things off by really getting familiar with the equipment that we're working with. Really get to know it. And I want you to get a real sense of what this equipment is all about, what it looks like, what it feels like. We're going to take a look at the physical aspects from the outside. We're going to look at the software side and get familiar with the software side of it. We're even going to crack one of these things open and look at the guts on the inside and see what this stuff is made of. To program it, we're going to have to connect to it. There's a console cable that we connect to it to start programming it. So we're going to take a look at how we're going to connect and start programming these devices. And what will happen during the startup process, what different steps it will go through and what these different steps mean. And we'll take a look at the command line, the syntax of it, and how the commands are structured. So that way when we start entering in programs into this device, we understand what we're entering into the device and how to program it. Then we're going to start looking at the software side of it and really get deep into how to navigate through the Cisco IOS. This is the part of the course that really gets into the hands-on, and we really are hands-on the rest of the course. We're going to be getting in there and just digging into figuring out this equipment. And we'll really get familiar with getting in and out of different modes. There are different modes and we need to understand different ways that we can get in and out of these different modes. We'll talk about getting help within the Cisco IOS. We'll get into show commands and some of the show commands that we'll be using and what they're used for. We'll talk about the command history and how to easily recall the command history to really cut down on the amount of typing that we have to do. We'll also get into a lot of shortcuts on how we can efficiently navigate the Cisco IOS. I mean, ultimately, that's the goal of this module, is to really understand and really efficiently be able to get in and out of the different areas of the Cisco IOS. And then we'll get into starting to configure these different devices. Whether you're talking about switches or routers or other Cisco devices, there's some things that we're going to want to configure, and we'll talk about generally what are those different steps that we would do to configure any device. And we'll get in there and configure the host name, the clock, passwords, management interfaces, set up SSH, we'll get into privilege levels, and we'll set up banners on this different equipment. And really all of those settings come down to saving in some sort of config. So we'll talk about the different configs that there are and how to save things so that way when you restart the device, you're not going to lose the information. So we'll get into managing config files, which is a critical part when it comes to being able to manage your Cisco devices. So we'll get into topics such as saving configs. We'll talk about capturing configs. We'll get into the initial configuration dialog. We'll talk about if you lost a password, how to recover from that. We'll get into the process that I use for making any kind of changes on these devices. We'll get into changing the boot loading file and talk about TFTP servers. And then we're going to start configuring the ports. Ultimately, this course is a lot about configuring ports because we're networking equipment and we need to interconnect that equipment. So we must understand how to configure ports. So we'll talk about switch port configuration. We'll talk about the MAC address table and how to view that. We'll get into routed interfaces and how to set them up on routers and on switches. We'll get into dual stack where we're configuring both IP version 4 and IP version 6. We'll get into resetting ports when we're done using them or maybe we want to reconfigure them. We'll get into troubleshooting certain interface issues. We'll get into CDP and LLDP, and we'll also configure a loopback interface. Once we have the basics down, we're going to want to start applying this. What would we see out in the real world? So we're going to start configuring a network. And so we'll come up with a scenario, a network that we're going to manage, that we're going to actually set up all of the aspects of this network. And so we'll create an IP address schema for it, and we'll start applying that. And we'll start programming the different equipment. So in the end, we'll actually have a working network. And as much as I'd like to say once you implement something, things are up and running and it all goes smoothly, but unfortunately that's not reality. There's times that we have to troubleshoot. Most of the time we're going to have to do some sort of troubleshooting, whether it's because we've misconfigured something or something's changed on our network, and we're gonna have to go in and fix it. And troubleshooting is a big part of this career. So we're gonna get familiar with that troubleshooting process. So our last module is gonna be around that troubleshooting process and how we can approach that troubleshooting process. This course is all about creating that great foundational knowledge that you can build off of in the future. That you're gonna become really efficient with the way that you study and with the way that you're going to actually work when you're in your career. So I will warn you that it's not going to cover a huge percentage of your CCNA test. It's only about 10% of the test, or maybe even a little less than that. But once again, it creates that great foundation that you're going to build off of in all future CCNA content. So I'm excited about kicking this off with you. There's some great content throughout here, and also there's a lot of hands-on activities. So it's a cool way to get things started.